Okay, are we ready for cosmological?
Yes. Good. Okay. Okay, so our argument was the cosmological argument. Throughout the argument, we will get into some of the aspects that will get looked at more in detail by the next group, I guess, the ontological group. But we're just going to start off by basically defining what we think the cosmological argument is and what the general understanding is. So the word cosmological argument is, or the word cosmological, is made up of two parts, cosmo or cosmos and logos. In that sense, cosmos is the Greek word for the universe or world, and logos is mainly translated as argumentation or like the pattern of an argument, because the weird thing with the cosmological argument is that that's actually not like the description would fit multiple different arguments. It's mostly an example for an argument pattern than an actual singular argument. Before we go further, there are a couple of words that we need to be clear on, just as the last group did, contingency and necessary stuff. Contingency in our case is something that is in a certain way but could have been otherwise. We will get into a different kind of contingency definition later on that is going to be necessary in order for Kant to look at the cosmological argument a bit differently. And necessary, well, we heard already from the last group, but something that exists and can't exist differently or can't not exist in any other world. Basically the whole argument comes from the question, why is there something instead of nothing? That's like at the heart of the actual cosmological argument. And there have been multiple different arguments made also by one single person we will get into next, by St. Thomas Aquinas. He gave 3 to 4, depending on how you want to define it, different arguments or argument types, but all come to the same conclusion basically, that God is a necessary being that has to exist. We're going to start off with
what's kind of like striking about Aquinas is sort of like arguments that he kind of firmly based them on sort of like in the natural world, or what he perceives to be a natural world. So he at the time believes it was kind of like scientific physical evidence for it. And so there's sort of parts of the arguments that kind of split down to kind of categorize in these observed and obvious evidence. So the first one kind of seems to tackle his kind of observation of motion, that like we currently live in a world in which things are moving. Movement is caused by movers. Things that cause motion, everything that's moving must have been set into motion by something else. That's why it's like moving. Something must have started the motion in the first place. And so from this he kind of prevents something called the infinite regress, that's just quite common along all his arguments, which is kind of basically stopping the logical chain that his existence relies on the existence of something else before that. And so from this he goes and says that God is basically the first mover, himself unmoved. Then the next one, which is very similar to motion, is his argument from causation, that some things are caused, anything that's caused has to be caused by something else. Since nothing causes itself, there can't be an infinite regress of causes, so there must have been a first causer, itself uncaused, that is God. So pretty much similar to motion. And then his third one is contingency, so they're contingent things, meaning something existence rely on something else. Contingent things can cause other contingent things, but they can't only be contingent things, because that would mean there's an infinite regress of contingency and possibility that nothing might have existed. An infinite regress is impossible, so there must be one necessary big thing, and that's God. And so there's a fourth one that seems to be attributed into degrees, which kind of basically said properties come in degrees. In order for there to be degrees of perfection, there must be something perfect against everything, which everything else is measured. God's the pinnacle of perfection. So basically, overall, kind of getting the gist that God is a necessary being.
Yeah. Before we move further, we want to go back to the argument of contingency, because that's basically the main argument. The others are kind of, but they say the same thing, but they're not as well thought out as the contingency argument. And especially because we kind of want to draw some parallels to Kant, it's important for us to look at the contingency argument. So there is one particular step that is going to be basically the core argument that Kant is going to use to look at the contingent or the cosmological argument a bit differently, and that happens with the third and fourth premise. He goes on, like Aquinas starts off by saying that things are contingent, which is something you can grant or not grant depending on what you believe. But when he moves from this argument to, but there are things, so therefore there has to be something else that made those things, it is kind of important to understand that, as the last group said, we don't really see the connection to a theistic kind of version of God as we think of it in like the Christian or whatever religion you have, kind of religion. It's mostly just an argument for some sort of architect. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a God who is omnipotent and omniscient and whatsoever. It just says that there is something that preceded other things. So that may be something you have to keep in mind while looking at the argument, and especially when Aquinas is saying, but there are things, some other philosophers have argued, well, obviously there is the point of skepticism, or are you a brain in a vat or whatever, and that can be easily disregarded by simply saying, well, okay, there might not be things in general, but there has to be at least one thing following from Descartes or whatever, and that thing has to be me. That's basically the same argument Kant is going to give later on. He's going to say, well, there must be necessary things because there's one contingent thing, being me, that exists, so there has to be a necessary thing that caused that contingent thing to exist. But yeah, if we move on now to the actual version of the argument that Kant gives, it's a bit different because he starts off by, well, trying to establish a similar but still different kind of necessary being. Yeah. So basically he has a different way of approaching the same argument, and he, in his version, but will become apparent after the third group, his version, it mostly depends on the ontological argument that's going to be, well, the next group, yeah. But yeah, so he sets out to establish a similar type of necessary being on the basis that there could be a being that couldn't exist in any other way. So now it's important to give a different definition for contingency from the one that we have presented first. So there was another philosopher called Wolff, who is actually in favor of the cosmological argument, who is a religious person and thinks that the cosmological argument works. And even that definition that is given by Wolff is whatever is alterable is contingent. So it's slightly different because it's not, the contingency in this case isn't concerned with whether a thing could exist in a different world or doesn't exist in a different world. It's just how the thing that actually exists is at the moment, and if it could be otherwise, or it could be different. So, for example, from that definition of contingency, could I exist but not with blonde hair? So with black hair or whatever. And using that definition himself, Kant gets to the argument, well, okay, so in that case, if I want a necessary being, then that being has to be a being that can't be altered in any way, shape, or form. But in order for that to be possible, the being has to be the most excellent and absolute perfect being, because it has to include everything. Otherwise, if it didn't include everything, it couldn't be. It could be different, so it can't be necessary. And this, at this point, we get to the whole problem that Kant sees, or the main problem Kant sees with the cosmological argument, because if you frame it in this way, using the new definition of contingency, you ultimately get to the ontological argument, because in order for something to be most excellent, it also has to exist, because that's the definition for being perfect, which is basically the ontological argument. And so he says, because it is based on the ontological argument, which is going to prove to be wrong, or not eligible as an argument really, he says the cosmological argument can't exist. And I mean, there are many other flaws with the cosmological argument as well. So I think some of the logically necessary claims of God, that he is logically necessary, don't make any sense if you think of him as Kant thinks. So as soon as you change some of the parameters of contingency and necessary, most of the argument doesn't make sense. Which of course you could say about most arguments, but especially in this case, because it's about a metaphysical claim, it's not really worth exploring further. Also, there are some, while reading the argument, you might feel reminded of what we did in week 2 when we were talking about the antinomy of causality, because there are the thesis and the antithesis, and the antithesis is basically the same argument. The antithesis is also saying that there has to be a prior cause to something else. So that's kind of the same thing, really. So we actually already did the cosmological argument in class, but yeah. I think... Have anything else to say?
So like, we're sort of relating that to the cosmological argument with the causality, sort of how Kant sees it, that the category of causality kind of belongs solely to the world of the phenomena, and that we have no right to kind of treat it as valid, because also that would mean from the world of, that would mean it kind of had to relate to the world of nominal realities in which God is held belongs, or that God belongs to. So he sees that it's not maybe that kind of Aquinas was wrong in to say that this observation of the world was wrong, that to attribute causality to things, it just seemed that it just belonged causality, the way that Kant in his critique of pure reason seems that Kant seems to say that causality belongs into the world of the senses, and then that would, and Aquinas' argument seems to be attributing the world of the senses to something that seems to be existing there and outside the world of the senses.
And that's right, without being entitled. So if you start with things that make sense within the empirical world, and then you make the assumption that something that works within the empirical world can offer you a leap up to the non-empirical world. And this is the problem for Kant. I mean, it's a standard also problem for Aquinas, but for Kant it's very big. Yeah, you're right.
Also, it doesn't really become apparent why something that is finite in a sort of chain reaction would also mean that the property of it being finite translates onto the actual chain. So why can't there be infinite regress in that sense? So what's the problem with that? And I don't think that's ever really explained well by Aquinas. He just says it can't be. So
it's a doctrinal assumption, the infinite regress. It's a doctrinal assumption about infinite regress. And it's also very vivid in the Islamic theologians for whom there can't be infinite regress, and they find different other ways. So, but this is close to religion. So, yeah. Anything else?
Do you want to say anything about how it links into the other two theories? The other two arguments?
the ontological and the...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We've got a couple more points on that. The cosmological argument is empirical. The argument is based on what we can see of the universe, whereas the ontological argument we're going to do next is purely a priori, because we are inferring the existence of God just from rational thought. But Kant's issue with the cosmological argument is that it depends on the ontological. So the cosmological argument is basically claiming that a high spin is necessary, but that's what the ontological argument is making as well. So Kant's point is that if we accept the ontological argument, then through rationalism, what is the point of going out and looking at the world empirically and coming to the same conclusion? So he says that the fact that the ontological argument is invalid means that the cosmological argument is invalid, and the design argument which we just had also depends on the cosmological. So there's a chain there, and if the ontological is invalid, then the cosmological is invalid, and then the design is invalid. So we think them all that way.
Perfect, that's exactly right. That's the strategy. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was excellent.
Hello everyone. We're doing the ontological argument and the nature of its... So ontology, or an ontological argument, is an argument that attempts to find the existence or nature of a being through its properties in themselves. So it doesn't actually tend to any empirical experience at all. It just uses rational and deduction of its predicates to identify if they create a contradiction or if they are true in and of themselves. So there have been many arguments for God's existence using the ontological methods. The one I'll be talking about is Anselm's, and he was the first to come up with an ontological argument. And so, yeah, what I basically just said, that we can deduce God's existence from the very definition of God. So, unlike God, no other entity's existence necessarily follows from its conceptual claim. So there are, like humans, we're obviously all reliant on parents, animals, etc. Anything in the world is reliant on some form of cause for its being. However, simply through the properties of the nature of God and the nature of God and its definition, Anselm and all the other ontological argumentarians say that it's just God is real in and of itself, purely due to the fact that the properties that entail God's existence would also necessarily entail perfection. Yeah. So this is the one that Anselm talks of the. Yeah. Oh, so that. Go back one sec. So yeah, its necessary existence. Obviously, if it's true in and of itself, it exists in every possible world, which is just a further reason for its necessary existence.
Just a footnote there. The clause of necessity as true in every possible world is Leibniz. Leibniz came up with the idea of, because everybody's talking about necessity, contingency. As you said before, the previous two presenters, you realize that the terms are used in all sorts of ways, to mean all sorts of things. And Leibniz sought to clarify this once and for all. He didn't, but he tried to clarify this once for all. He thought necessity is something that is true. So he had a nice semantic conception, true in all possible worlds. There is no world in which this is not true. So if I say that he meant this both for propositions and entities. In contemporary philosophy, you don't go for entities being necessary, just for propositions. But let's say, if we think the proposition 1 + 1 = 2 is necessarily true, then there is no world in which this is not true. So that's necessary. So God is necessary, this time a being, not a proposition. Is necessary means that God is true, is the case in every possible world. Yeah? Whereas possible is only in some worlds. Yeah? Good.
Oh yeah, that was. Thanks for reminding me about that. I don't think I actually included that.
So it's because you used it, so I thought I'd clarify it because it's not something that trips off the tongue.
So in Anselm's argument, so it was Descartes who used the perfection one, but Anselm, the first one who did the ontological argument, used greatness, like greatness pretty much meaning perfection as well. Just like God entails everything great about anything in the world that is conceivably, etc., etc. And he believed that this conception of greatness or ultimate perfection is conceivable in humans, which he thought to entail that God does exist because of this conceivable greatness. His first argument, he provided two. The first one was a lot weaker, so the first one he spoke of just existence being a necessary predicate of God, which then he came to refine, and this is what Katrina said, was that necessary existence obviously entails existence in every possible world and entails properties of necessary existence, i.e. being existent in every possible world, and something else as well. There was another thing. Whereas existence in itself does not entail any properties.
That is a very important point. That's a very important distinction because necessary existence is a very weird property. In fact, only one being has it. Yeah, but if you say existence, assuming it's a property, yeah, like lots of things have it. So that's why all the people who are interested in that, like ontological arguments and stuff, they like the second type more because you can reconstruct it in fancy ways and modal logic and blah blah and play around it a bit. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's all from me. Oh, no. Oh yeah, no, so I did actually talk about it. I did write it down. Necessary existence is clearly to be a property, as opposed to just existence or X exists. X necessarily exists entails a number of claims that attribute particular properties to X. For example, its existence does not depend on existence of any other being, and X has reason for its existence in its own nature. Further, its necessary existence entails its existence in every possible world. And yeah, that was just like a little recap of the one. There's something else I thought. No, I don't think I actually wrote it down.
Well, just a note on that. I might be wrong in thinking.
Yeah.
No, I looked this up. It was like how there's an idea of it would be absurd for there to be a being, for God not to exist through this kind of definition, because if God is the greatest thing conceivable, yet does not exist, then there might be something that is even greater, because it would be that thing that does exist.
Yeah, that's the first version of the argument. Actually,
Yeah.
that's the thing with the fool. When Anselm asked the fool, "Can you think of God?" And the fool says yes. Is God like fantastically super duper? The fool says yes. Does God exist? The fool says no. And he's a fool because he can entertain all these perfections and yet deny existence, which means he has contradicted himself, the fool that is, because only a being with all these perfections and existence can be perfect, can have these perfections. So, yeah. Good. Excellent. Thank you.
Moving on. Just a little quote.
Thank you.
Just saying how ontological arguments abstract from all experience and invert the existence of a highest cause entirely a priori from these concepts. Just referring to the fact that, unlike, say, cosmological argument, it's based just on reasoning and can be completely abstracted from any experience. Well, the idea is that that's what people who propose an ontological argument are trying to do. Just a little note there. And then counter responses. There's three of them.
Yes, it's got three responses. One is that the concept of necessary being is itself completely unintelligible. And the next is that there's the judgment itself must either be analytic or synthetic, and both are completely contradictory, don't make any sense. And the last one is that existence is not a predicate, which is obviously the big one.
Cool. Put quoting twice by accident, sorry.
Right, so first Kant argues that the concept of an absolutely necessary being is unintelligible. So to compare, he considers a necessary proposition, which is a triangle has three angles. The necessity of this proposition, Kant states, is contingent on the existence of the object itself. So if a triangle exists, it must have three angles, but that doesn't mean three angles are absolutely necessary or a triangle is absolutely necessary. So similarly, to say that God exists necessarily is only to say if God exists, he exists necessarily, rather than God exists, full stop. He goes further, arguing that denying the existence of God isn't contradictory to the definition of God, again using the necessary proposition of a triangle for comparison, which is to posit a triangle and yet to reject its three angles is contradictory. There's no contradiction at all in rejecting the triangle along with its three angles. So you deny God's existence altogether, and all of its qualities completely on the terms of existence. There's no contradictions.
Should I go ahead?
But that's such a very neat argument. I think it's a very neat argument. Yeah. And that's why contemporary ontological defenders of the ontological argument, they do, like in modal logic, that what's that shape? It's a if, and the square is necessary. So diamond, we were trying to say diamond God exists, then this square exists, and that's what they try to prove. This is the what you have there, but imagine diamond and then square, and this is like the Holy Grail, and this is what people try to find different arguments for, and they do try, but that's exactly right. Yeah, and it's all down to
The second argument against these, the criticism is just kind of looking at the difference between an analytic and synthetic proof, because either is contradictory. So Kant argues that next that the statement God exists must either be analytic or synthetic, as every judgment is. If the proposition is analytic, which the ontological argument assumes, then the judgment is true only due to the meaning ascribed to the words God and to exists, and so is tautological, and thus can't tell us anything about what actually exists in reality. So in other words, to say God as a possible thing exists is to infer existence as belonging to possibility, and then have inferred existence from the fact that God is possible, which is like a miserable tautology. So the statement can't be analytic. If instead God exists as a synthetic judgment, then the ontological argument fails in itself. Establishing the truth of the judgment would require evidence, reference to experience, which is what I mean by that. And thus the existence of God isn't a necessary consequence of the definition of God. So the judgment can't either be analytic or synthetic.
And you see now how he uses to good effect that distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments that we encountered at the very start, and annoyed you all so much because, and we haven't used it really very much. We did some synthetic a priori judgments in terms of metaphysics, but now you can use it as a tool to cut through other metaphysics. Yeah, thanks.
So finally, Kant's most comprehensive and influential response to the alleged ontological proof is his theory that existence isn't a predicate. So by this he means that existence doesn't actually add anything to a concept itself, it merely indicates that the concept refers to an object, like in reality. The ontological argument requires existence to be a real predicate, like omnipotence can be applied to something, but it isn't so. So the judgment God is omnipotent involves two concepts, like God and omnipotence, the subject and predicate respectively. It is, in this statement, just asserts the relation of these concepts to each other. It asserts the predicate in relation to the subject, as he says. To say God is, by itself, equivalent to saying God exists, adds nothing to the definition of God, just posits an object in relation to the concept. So, like, the concept 50 quid. What £50 means is exactly the same whether I've got a £50 note in my hand or just thinking of £50. All that changes when I say I have a £50 note is that an object is posited in relation to the concept of £50. So that the object, it doesn't actually change the definition at all. Yeah. So the ontological argument, Kant claims, only works if existence is a predicate. If it isn't, and so it doesn't apply to a subject, existence can't be applied to God like omnipotence can. So denying God's existence doesn't contradict the concept of God as a perfect being. It just denies that there's an object to satisfy the concept of a being than which no greater can be imagined.
Perfect. And notice that even people who later on have been criticisms of this, say, no, it can't be a predicate, you can still rephrase it in contemporary logic. Let's say with Martians, what are they? Inhabitants of planet Mars. You know, this is what you put in the square brackets, right? And then you can ask the existential question, but are there any? Yeah? Re-Martians, what are the properties are inhabitants of planet Mars, they exist. Yeah? But these are the properties that you attach to the thing. You can still ask, but are there any? So it still works like that. So, good.
That's it. Okay.
Excellent. You know, everything there is to know